Good. Well, if I get a bit too loud or a bit too soft, just sing out. I want to begin by talking about the last 2 million years. Human beings have been evolving, or our ancestors have been evolving on this planet for around 2 million years. People like us have been around for maybe 100,000 years. Now, during all that 100,000 years, or almost all of it, except the last 200, birth rates have been very high, many babies and children around, and death rates have been very high, particularly death rates of infants and children. Even moving into historical times, infant mortality was extraordinarily high. For example, research in the city of York in England, from records, shows that in the 17th century, for every 10 baby girls born, only one lived to the age of 20. Things were rather better for boys, 1 in 4 lived till the age of 20. Adam Smith wrote in 1775 that it is not uncommon in the Highlands of Scotland to meet a woman who has borne 20 children and does not have 2 alive. In many parts of England, half the children were dead by the age of 4 or 5, and everywhere in England, half of them were dead by the age of 9 or 10. Despite this, societies managed to reproduce themselves, but the process was devastatingly inefficient. The waste in human lives, work, grief, misery was incredible. One consequence of this was that adult women of reproductive age were relatively scarce, and this led to harsh attempts to control their sexual and reproductive behaviour. You wanted them to reproduce plenty, but in the correct circumstances. When death rates began to fall and their relative scarcity was not as bad, then some of these attempts were relaxed. And this is the core of an article written by John McGuinness and Julio Diaz only a few years ago, which they titled The Reproductive Revolution. And I really like that title because it gives a sort of feel of the drama of the change that we have witnessed in the last 200 years, which, when you think of the 100 and 1,000 years time span, is a very brief blink of time. Now, the change that they're referring to is conventionally called the demographic transition. But I think that's got a kind of staid, inevitable, slow-moving feel to it, whereas in fact, in relative terms, what we were looking at was quite sudden, quite dramatic. So, with the start of the reproductive revolution, death rates fell. They fell because the agricultural revolution improved the production of food, and the industrial revolution meant that transport improved, so food was more available, and then engineering and public works brought clean water and sewerage. That brought down death rates. And later on, birth rates fell too. This is as parents acquired the knowledge and the means and the courage to stand up to those harsh political and religious controls. And there's a wonderful book written about this period in Australia by Neville Hicks called This Sin and Scandal. And he takes his title from the Royal Commission into the Decline of the Birth Rate held in New South Wales in 1904. And one of the commissioners said, you know, we owe this terrible change in the birth rates to the fact that there were some married women who did not hesitate to pollute their marriage bed with the devices of the brothel. So that was the kind of thing that our great-grandparents were up against, but they seem to have run through. If we look at the trajectory of this in Australia, in Melbourne in the 1850s, infant mortality was 200 per 1,000. That meant that for every 1,000 babies born alive, 200 died in the first year of their lives. 20% loss. Now that was bad, but back in the UK it was higher. And it wasn't all about poverty. In the 17th century, infant mortality for the royal families of Europe was 250 per 1,000. We know about them because of the records that were kept. Well, by 1904, infant mortality was down to 82 per 1,000, and now it's 3.6. When I began studying this sort of stuff in the 70s, Australia's infant mortality rate was 14 per thousand. And that was as good as it was going to get. Japan was publishing rates of 6 per thousand, and everybody thought they must be cheating because that wasn't possible. But it is possible. The reproductive revolution has been splendid, and this is why I say it is the best thing to have happened to the human race in the last 100,000 years. However, I just want to show you what a pre-revolutionary population looks like. This is Afghanistan a few years ago. Of course, their infant mortality and other mortality rates have fallen, so the death rates that kept ancestral populations either not growing or only growing very slowly don't apply there, but it is incredibly youthful. Almost half the population are children under the age of 15. Imagine trying to govern and run a country that basically consists of primary school children. Well, a key consequence of the reproductive revolution is that the average age of the population goes up. It goes up a lot. We compare that population pyramid with the ones I'm going to show you of Australia now. But you have to think, do we want to avoid mingling with older people so much that we would rather go back to the misery and squalor of the 17th century? I think the question kind of answers itself. But it is extraordinary that this wonderful improvement in human welfare has been treated as if it was a terrifying change for the worse. Of course, it's not surprising that there should be some anxiety about it, because after all, human beings haven't lived with an older age structure ever before. So it's not surprising there should be some nervousness about what are all this change going to mean. And then, of course, there is the fact that the costs of children are normally private costs that are borne by their parents and families, whereas the costs incurred with people who are dependent at other ages, including those aged 65 plus, tend more to be public costs. So governments are very aware of them, and governments find them easy to measure and to deplore, whereas the costs of children to parents are not something that they're so concerned about. Well, the concerns about the ageing of the population in Australia date back to the 1970s, and there the main anxiety being expressed was defence. How was a pack of oldies going to be able to defend the country? But now, or from the 1990s on, the main concerns have been about labour force participation and its associated link with income tax and healthcare costs, which Michael's already mentioned to us. So there's been much talk about the so-called dependency burden, which is usually presented to us in terms of the number of people of so-called working age, 15 to 64, as a ratio towards the number of older people. But let's just have a look at where Australia has been. So that is our population in 1901. That calculated from the first census in 1911. A lot of children, not as many, the proportion of children not as high as that of Afghanistan today, but the so-called working age group, 15 to 64, 61%. Move forward almost to today, and it's 68%. That's a lot more. However, this is a passing phase that we are going through. We're going through this demographic sweet spot where the proportion of children is a lot lower and the proportion of older people isn't as high as it's going to get. So when people say, oh, labour force participation has dropped by 0.5%, it could partly be because of moving through this demographic sweet spot until we get to where we might be in 2061. Actually, that's not a very realistic picture because it assumes nil net migration. And we know that the political elites are hell-bent on increasing our population with very high levels of net overseas migration. But I picked this one. It's one of the projections that the ABS published at the end of 2013. It assumes a total fertility rate of 2, high life expectancy, which means people living into their mid-90s. They had another set of projections with medium life expectancy, which only had people living into their late 80s, but I picked this one. And you can see that the proportion of elderly, if we count being 65 plus as elderly, has grown a lot, and that of people of so-called working age has fallen. But before we focus on that, I just want to go back to the baby boomers. So here we are back in 2013. You hear a lot of media discussion about how on earth are we going to cope with the baby boomers when they hit retirement. And sure, there are more of them than of the older people right before them in the population pyramid. But coming up behind them are cohorts that are just as big, if not bigger. So that the idea we could only work these baby boomers out of the system, we get back to normal, is a furphy. But all of this stuff that focuses on just who's aged 15 to 64 and who's older is pretty silly. First of all, not all of the working age people are in paid work. Some of the over 65s are, and it pays no attention to the children. All of those dependents who are costing their parents and grandparents a packet. Well, this is why I spent a bit of time drawing up this graph. Now what that's showing you is, first of all, who is dependent in a physical sense, that they really need help on a daily basis from someone else in order to get through the day. And that red bar going up the centre are people who've been classified by the ABS as being profoundly or severely disabled. And that means that they sometimes or always need help from someone else with one of the 3 core activities of self-care, communication, or moving around. Not with all 3 of them always, but with at least one of them sometimes. And you can see they're distributed at all age groups. In fact, if you add them up at the moment, there's more under the age of 65 than there is over the age of 65. And I personally would classify all of the children 0 to 4 in that group too. But I didn't want to play fast and loose with the ABS figures, so the children are coloured pink. Then that dark blue line going up beside the disabled people are the carers. Now, you can't do everything with a graph like this. Some of those carers, especially at the younger ages, are working, and some of them, nearly 9%, are themselves profoundly or severely disabled. And I'm sure you all know people who are in that circumstance. The beige coloured ones are those not in the labour force. Doesn't mean that they're not working, but they're not in the paid labour force. Black is the unemployed, light green is part-time employed, dark green is full-time, blue is studying, and the purpley bars are those who are studying full-time but also have paid work. Now, the purpose of drawing up this graph is to show that who's dependent and who's not is not a crude function of the age structure. And there are quite a few green shoots over the age of 65. Now, what that graph can show us, it can show us something about labour force participation, and that older people, a number of older people are engaged in the labour force, but it doesn't show us this over time. And for that, we've got this rather busy graph here showing labour force participation over the last 36 years for people aged 55 and over. The men are either blue or black. And if you look at that top blue line, you can see there was a bit of a trend, or especially with the black line too, there was a trend in the 1980s for men to retire early, but that trend has been fairly much reversed. But I think the exciting ones are the top pinky line, which are the women aged 55 to 59. And you can see this as an example of the reproductive revolution working its way through, that as women were liberated from having to care for children more and more in their more mature years, were moving into the labour force. And there were time to show you graphs about people in their 40s and so forth. You will see that even more clearly. Now, the recent survey by the ABS showed that nearly 9% of men aged 60 plus say they are never going to retire, and a bit over 5% of women aged 60 plus say they are never going to retire. So there's every likelihood that those participation rates to older age groups will continue to rise. But this is a graph that I pinched from Jane O'Sullivan. She very graciously gave me permission to use it. It was her jolly good idea to go to the World Bank data bank and get data on labour force participation by age structure. So what we've got on the y-axis is the labour force participation rate expressed as a percentage of the population aged 15 plus, by, along the x-axis, the proportion of the population aged 65 plus. So out there to the right, we've got Japan as the oldest player in this graph, and out there to the left, we've got Chile as the youngest one. And the labour force participation rates between them are not very different. Yes, there is a slight negative association that sloping line shows, but it is not statistically significant. An R squared of 0.08 won't get you anywhere. There are some standout countries there, like the Netherlands, which has an older population, much older than Australia's, but nearly 84% in the labour force. Well, let's move from that now to talking a little bit about healthcare costs. So we had a very good intro to that just before I spoke. One of the strange things is, one of the heartwarming things is that older people are getting healthier. There's quite a lot of research around showing this, not so much explaining why, but people have been counting noses and doing a 20-year longitudinal study and so forth, and finding lower rates of dementia, lower rates of being highly disabled, and that's showing up here in the Australian data. Now, these are the ABS surveys, disability, ageing and carers, and that's comparing ones 14 years apart. And if you just look at the two, at the orange and the pink line there, which is females, and focus on the people aged 85 plus, and you can see that in that 14-year-old period, the proportion of women aged 85 plus and designated as being profoundly or severely disabled has dropped by about 10 percentage points. And for men, it's dropped by about 8 percentage points, which is marvellous. And this shows up in the proportions in residential care, that is, nursing homes. Now, that's a very busy table, so I suggest we just focus on the last two more vulnerable age group categories. The 85 to 89 group, the proportions in residential care have dropped by nearly 5 percentage points, and for the 90 plus by slightly more than 5 percentage points. That's wonderful. But still, there are going to be a lot more older people, so even though a smaller proportion of them are going to be sick, there's going to be a lot of them. So what about the fear that this is going to overwhelm the healthcare system? Well, this graph is taken from a Grattan Institute publication. Yes, health costs have been rising at a pretty brisk clip. Over that 10-year period, $41.5 billion. But only 7% of that was due to population ageing. 18% to population growth itself, with the effects of ageing cleaned out of it. But overwhelmingly, it's more services and better services. So the hip replacement might be costly, but it's keeping people going in a way that they wouldn't have been 30 years ago when there weren't such things. So it's part of an increase in our standard of living. Yeah, maybe there could be economies made, but overall, so far, it's not due to ageing. Well, might it not be in the future? Well, here's a similar graph to the one I just showed you, but this time it's healthcare expenditure as a percentage of GDP, both private and public, by the proportion age 65 plus. Again, Japan's out there to the right. I haven't heard that it's all whips and racks there in Japan, that they don't look after elderly people, but they're not spending a fortune on it. The United States is the standout country there, and it has a relatively youthful population. Well, that's a bit of an overview of the costs. What about the benefits? Well, apart from the obvious benefit of having accomplished the reproductive revolution, what are the other benefits? Well, one is possibly the fact that knowing that we and our children and our grandchildren are going to live for a long time gives us more of a focus on the future, not just the immediate future, but the distant future, because we're going to be here to experience it ourselves. In 1960, John Wyndham wrote a science fiction book called The Trouble with Lichen. The scientists discovered this rare lichen growing in a remote part of China, and if you ate this stuff, you would live to be 200 years or 300 years old. And you think, oh God, if this gets out, the population explosion is just going to be terrible. Everybody hanging around for 3 or 4 or 5 times as long as they were meant to. But then other people said, well, hang on, if we're all going to live for 200 or 300 years, won't we be a little bit more careful with what we do to planet Earth? Now that, of course, is speculation. But even as level-headed a person as Christopher Kent, the Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, has recently said that knowledge that we're going to live for a long time would give people more of an incentive to invest in education and training. And that has more or less happened, actually. That between 2001 and 2012, the proportion of the population aged 15 to 64 who had a post-school qualification rose from 47% to 57%. Now, that might be partly credentialism, the idea that a good job is a relatively scarce commodity in the positional economy. What happens if there's more competition for goods in the positional economy? Well, their price goes up, and the price that we pay for a good job is our pieces of paper, so we're going to need more of them. So it might be partly explained by that, but let's hope that there's also some real training and education has happened in that 10 percentage point increase. But one factor that is not speculative and that we know for sure is that rates of crime and violence go down with an older population. In Australia, the age group 15 to 19 commits 5 times more crimes than any other age group category. And if we look at the world as a whole, now here we've got, it has got a bit scrambled, just moving from a Mac to a PC. That x-axis is now measuring the youthfulness of the population, the percent under the age of 15. And the X and the vertical index is this global peace index, which I think should be called a global violence index, as a high score means that you're a more violent population. And you can see with the red diamonds up there that the countries that are in the news for war, unrest, rioting, terrorists, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Egypt, they're all very youthful. And in reportage of these horrible events, we don't hear anything like enough about the demography of these countries, struggling to find jobs and opportunities for hordes of young people, especially males. Of course, we do get a R squared of, scrambled, it's 0.2, it's 0.2229, almost 0.3, which means that nearly 30% of the variance in violence can be explained by the youthfulness of the population. Of course, it doesn't explain everything. Up there on the top left, we've got Russia, which is not particularly youthful, but a rather violent place. Let's get back now home ground in peaceful Australia. There we are, all green and peaceful down there. What are some of the other benefits of an older population? Well, we've talked about older people as carers. Also, older people provide a lot of help to their adult children. Financial help and help in all sorts of practical help. It's been estimated that up until the age of 75, net flows of finances and help go from the old to the young. Now that's private help. As far as public finances are concerned, yes, older people do take more out of the tax system than younger people do. And I don't know of any research that tries to balance out those two flows. But it's worth remembering the strong flows of financial and practical help that go from the old to the young. And of course, one really important source of practical help is grandparenting, minding the grandchildren. In Britain, they have this really big study called the Millennium Study going, which is of 19,000 children who were born in the year 2000 to 2001. Now, of these children, those that have mothers in the paid workforce, half of them are being entirely minded by grandparents, and 3/4 of them are being minded by grandparents part of the time. We all know about older people as volunteers, and this is volunteering outside of the family circle. 12% of those 85 plus volunteer outside the family circle, and 33% of those aged 65 to 84. And those numbers, I'm sure, would be a lot higher if they weren't so tied up with the grandchildren. And Judith Healy, she wrote a splendid report on the benefits of an ageing population for the Australia Institute about a decade ago, and she lists a lot of advantages of employing older people. Productive, they're not, being productive doesn't decline with age, but the quality of work improves. Corporate memory, less job turnover, which leads to lower training costs. Loyalty, work ethic, these are usually higher. And it's good if the company structure reflects the customer base. Now, these are details. They're important, but they're details. The overriding picture is this, that demographic ageing means that the proportion of children and infants will ease. That's the core benefit of an ageing population, that it frees up more human resources for doing a host of other things apart from caring for children. A host of other things can be paid work, can be volunteering. Regardless, it frees up an enormous human resource that simply wasn't around in the past. Well, how am I going for time? Does anyone?
I think it's fine, you can keep going.
Okay, right. I just want to talk now briefly about the idea that mass immigration can cure ageing. This is what Australia's median age has been doing over the last 110 years. We're now a bit over 37. Now the median age is obviously going to rise, but first of all, what's going to happen to the overall population? Well, the most recent projections, I say they were published in November 2013. There were 24 of them. Now, I've just focused on the ones that use the high life expectancy assumption because I wanted to take what I thought was the best scenario and what some of our critics might think was the worst scenario. I can't show all 12 on the graph because you wouldn't be able to make head nor tail of it, so I've picked 6. 3 high migration ones and 3 nil net migration ones. So here they are. And that takes us through to 2101 with that top red one, we'd be over 70 million by 2101. Unfortunately, there's the 3 immigration scenarios that they modelled don't include the 215,000 that the intergenerational report is using. But sort of somewhere closer to the 200,000 one would be what we were looking at. But what I'd like, oh, and the green and the blue and the grey, those are the 3 that show different total fertility assumptions, but keep the net overseas migration at nil. So that green one there is one that interests me, because that's the stable stationary population, taking us around to 26 or 27 million and leaving us there. But I'd also like you to look at that black one, which has got a low total fertility rate and a very high level of net overseas migration. Now, what happens if we leave the total fertility rate alone and try to top up with migrants? Well, this shows you the median age according to those 6 projections. And it's all pretty similar, really. It doesn't make a whole heap of difference. But what really interested me, and I highlighted it here, is the way that that black one and the green one cross over. And in fact, projection series 14 produces an older population than the stable stationary one. Well, just to wrap up, it's going to happen anyway, unless we go back to the 17th century. But it's the best thing that's happened in the last 100,000 years.